Thank you very much, Edward, and what a pleasure it is to come all the way to BC for the very first time come to Abbotsford and to see your wonderful university and to be good friends. And thank you very much, Madam President, for your kind introduction to my work. I almost feel as though you set a context for me, so I don't have to do that. But so wonderful to see Dr. McKenzie and Dr. Kufo, both of them my students. I know Dr. Kufo mentioned the Children on War project, and it could not have been a success without Dr. McKenzie, who did some fabulous work on the ground in Sierra Leone. When I was working on children affected by war, child soldiers. It was a very difficult time. I remember that time, but she made it through and was able to do a very, very good segment of the research for me. And it's wonderful to see you all here. I'm glad that we are here in person and not just online. I spent the last 2.5 years mostly doing my lectures online, so it's good to see you in person. Today, I'm looking at a very interesting subject, the Interregnum, a major shift in world order. And I know that that word interregnum, you're probably wondering, what does that mean? Someone said to me today, that was the first thing that came to her mind when she saw the term interregnum. What does interregnum really mean? Is this a special political science term? It's really a historical term that's been used for a very long time to talk about the shifts that occur, the period, the space of time between one world order and the next. And I think I'm really living through that space of time right now. Really is a shift, a transformation, almost a shifting of tectonic plates in world order right now. And that means that we're living in a time of flux and turbulence, and we see it's happening almost every day. And I wanted to show you something. I don't know if you can get this to work here for me. Maybe I could need Edward's help. But I wanted to show you the small something that's happening as we speak. We're not in Russia, of all places. This is a small clip of what's happening in Russia today. Now, that's actually happening in Russia, in the streets of Moscow. People are actually protesting the war in Ukraine. And we know that this is very unusual in the dictatorial Russian state to have people come out and take the risk of protesting what's going on in Ukraine. But that's what's happening. And I could show you another clip of a major transformation that's happening in Pakistan right now in terms of the topography of Pakistan because of the large flooding that's happening there. People are losing lives and property. And I know that Abbotsford has gone through some of this as well. So you know that climate change is a reality. And as my former Prime Minister of Barbados, I used to live in Barbados, so I call her the Prime Minister of Barbados. Mia Motley has said recently, we have to stop using the term climate change and talk about climate crisis, because that's the reality that we face right now. We're in a climate crisis. And this climate crisis is causing us to think very seriously about how we govern the world. The need for resilient structures that need to be put in place in order to protect individuals from disaster because of the climate. And the need to sort of get away from fossil fuels and sort of use non-renewable sources of energy in order to be able to advance our society and save ourselves from this kind of crisis that we're in. Now, for scholars and observers of international relations who've been following geopolitical and socioeconomic trends, particularly since the end of the Cold War, our world appears to be ungovernable. The post-Cold War period has been marked, I think, by an intensification of globalization, with all its attendant negative effects, and by deglobalization, as this sort of inevitable counter-response to hyper-globalization that exists. This period is also characterized as an era of ushering in a new world disorder. I think, and yet we have institutions created since 1945, institutions of governance, of global governance, like the United Nations system, that are supposed to manage, they're supposed to address the global problems that we are facing today, and to steer us into a future that's more peaceful, more just, more stable, more sustainable, and more prosperous. You just have to look at the targets of the 2015 Millennium Development Goals and the concomitant 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals and its 169 targets, to see the normative desire that is in place for strengthening global solidarity on the part of member states of the United Nations to establish some semblance of global governance by institutions and agencies of this 77-year-old organization. I am arguing here in this presentation that the extant institutions of global governance, including but not limited to the United Nations system, are more or less decisions frozen in time. They're decisions frozen in time because they were created at a historical juncture when sovereignty-bound entities reigned supreme, the nation state as a sovereignty-bound entity. Today, those institutions are being forced to operate in a turbulent, what I call complex, interdependent, and intermestic era. An era in which sovereignty-free and sovereignty-bound actors are forced to jostle and compete for position on the global stage. Under the ellipsoidal glare and intensity of the spotlight at this critical moment in our history, post-World War II institutions like the United Nations are revealing themselves to be severely defective, ineffective, inefficient, and largely irrelevant. So this creates what's called a crisis of global governance at this moment in our history. And it's been triggered in large part by an intense and growing interest in the issue of governance at all levels. This is not a time to be having a knee-jerk reaction to what's going on, or what I call a reflexive moment. It's time for silent reflection and contemplation. It's a time for us to reconceptualize what global governance actually means in the 21st century. For the 21st century. It's a propitious moment for constructing a new global governance paradigm. And that's what I'm trying to do with my research at Yale for the Fulbright. To assist us in this sort of introspective exercise, we may need to shift from problem-solving type of theorizing to embrace a critical theory approach that stands outside the prevailing understandings of what global governance has come to mean. And in Gramscian terms, and Robert Cox is one of the Gramscian scholars who said this as well, this would require an empirical examination of the patchwork concoction that we have labeled as global governance today. For us to see clearly, and this is described accurately, the post-Cold War, what they call fragmentative and complex interdependent environment within which the architecture is being constructed, the architecture of global governance is being constructed. Such an exercise, I think, is important at this stage. If our normative goal is to ensure that the extant multilateral institutions, like the United Nations system, are truly fit for purpose. And to be fit for purpose means that we have to be relevant to the rapidly changing conditions that exist around us. In conceptual and practical terms, being fit for purpose may require what I call a Kuhnian paradigm shift from a reformist and adaptive strategies to those of transformation and reconceptualization of the very reason that of what global governance functions are all about. And in the absence of world government, I think this is very important at this critical stage in our history. Now to the interregnum. And I might sort of shift to the interregnum. Here we are. I can raise some questions that we should ask ourselves at this particular crucial moment. Global politics in the early part of the 21st century has been dominated by some gruesome acts of rampant terrorism, multilateral and unilateral reprisals for those acts of terrorism, global downturns, hyper-globalization, deglobalization, mounting strife, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And this is a turbulent time that reveals cracks, if not a total breakdown in the prevailing global order, and has held and led us to shout out and demand the establishment of new institutions of global governance to replace the worn existing ones that exist. This is not the first time in world history that we've had prevailing systems of governance being challenged by pronounced structural forces for change. Over centuries, we've had repeated attempts at reforming existing international institutions and creating new ones to tame the conflicts and disorders of those periods. And more recently, during the immediate post-Cold War period, we witnessed the removal of some of the structural and ideological underpinnings of superpower conflicts between the US and the USSR. That characterized the last previous century. Apart from relaxing global tensions, this changed structural condition ostensibly reduced the major security threat that the world faced at that time. And during the Cold War, that is the threat of nuclear war between two heavily armed military camps that could have resulted in what we like to call mutual assured destruction, or MAD. By the end of that precarious balance of power period between the two superpowers, the end is something around 1989-1990, created a climate of uncertainty, the rise in civil conflicts, the spread of internecine violence in places like Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, in Somalia, in Sudan, and the former Yugoslavia. In the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there have been approximately 93 conflicts around the world in which over 5.5 million people were killed, 75% of them civilians. Almost all of these conflicts were intra-state conflicts as opposed to interstate conflicts, and this explains the disproportionate number of civilians that died or remained as a result of this conflict. Now, this immediate post-Cold War period was also characterized by an exponential increase in transnational challenges. Some of these challenges included the horizontal proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, small arms and light weapons, illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in particular, the spread of hate material, ideologies of hate, the increased consumption of pornography and sexual slavery, computer hacking, cyber theft, cyber warfare, and increasing drug trafficking, trafficking of women and children, and an increase in mass migration and a number of internally displaced persons. Forced labor, organized criminal activity, financial market collapses, piracy on the high seas, and we did a project about piracy in the Horn of Africa that was funded by the Qatar government because of their interest in what was going on in the high seas, off the coast of Malacca Straits, and also off the coast of Somalia and Nigeria, and the circumvention of national regulatory policies and taxes, etc. Now, certainly, The national institutions that are supposed to express people's preferences on these matters and increase the effectiveness of coping with them, many of these national institutions are not able to do so. And the post-World War II institutions of governance that were designed to address the interstate issues were suddenly showing signs at the end of the Cold War, not only of inefficiency and ineffectiveness, as I said before, but also, quite frankly, of irrelevance. In addition, many of the regional institutions do not fare any better. So you have institutions like the European Union, CARICOM, ASEAN, African Union. Many of these regional organizations were supposed to be stopgap measures to deal with these problems, and they haven't fared much better. And this raised an alert among most international politics, observers and scholars and practitioners of the need for a new global governance architecture that would eventually and effectively deal with transnational and interdomestic issues. The debacle in Somalia, which you all remember, the Rwandan genocide, at times the indiscriminate politically motivated slaughter in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that you've all read about, I think. Sierra Leone, Liberia, Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire, the continued violence in other places in the Middle East, in Asia, in Chechnya, in Latin America, now in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, the list goes on and on. They all indicate a persistent adherence to a culture of violence as hyper-nationalism, terrorism, and long-suppressed ethnic conflicts reared their ugly heads in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Now, other human tragedies, gross human rights violations have occurred in so-called failed states, where the degeneration or the total absence of national governance and national government structures has meant that civilians were particularly vulnerable to concatenated violence and at times random acts of violence, such as kidnappings, murders, internally displaced persons, etc. Thousands of children were and continue to be recruited as child soldiers both by government and rebel forces, as Dr. McKenzie knows very well. And this continues to today. The destruction of national infrastructures and governmental and societal and institutions worth billions of dollars was due at times to internecine violence, but also at other times to natural and man-made disasters, tsunamis, hurricanes, floods, during this immediate post-Cold War period. Again, national governments found it very difficult to address these problems and the spillover effects of these problems. Sometimes spillover effects associated with internal conflicts and humanitarian disasters. Similarly, international governmental organizations like the United Nations, regional intergovernmental bodies like the African Union, have all struggled to cope with the increasingly transnational and interdomestic nature of the problem. And by interdomestic, what I mean is that this dividing line that we normally have between the external and the internal is now so blurred that the governance of both things have to be reconsidered in an interdomestic setting. In general, the narrative I painted just now is a quick sort of panoramic scan of what can only be described as a new world disorder. An environment of turbulence, of flux, of fragmentation, of disequilibrium, of uncertainty that cries out for the establishment of novel forms of governance, novel forms of government processes, novel forms of government institutions, since the existing ones are woefully inadequate and woefully ineffective. But this picture is only sort of one part of the puzzle of this interregnum. The interregnum also features an integrative and fragmentary set of forces. I call it fragmigration. James Rosnell actually used that term first when he talked about fragmigration as meaning that there are forces of fragmentation, forces of integration, almost acting at the same time. And that tension of fragmigration is what's causing us to think very seriously about the nature of governance, of that kind of situation. James Rosnell also alerted us to some of the ways in which the advent of dynamic technologies has resulted in the decline of distances in the modern world. He called it distance, proximities. Technological advances in communications and transportation have resulted in an increase in the complex interdependence of the globe. For those political scientists who follow this kind of thinking, you just have to go to Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye to read their book in 1977, which raised this issue of complex interdependence. Modern communications via newspapers and radios, television, telephones, fax machines, computers, the internet, social media, emails, etc., appear to be producing contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, uniting, on the other hand, fragmenting audiences. On the one hand, exacerbating social cleavages, as well as bringing about disparate groups bringing together. Sometimes heightening existing antagonisms, as well as providing means through which such frictions can be resolved. Sometimes eroding national boundaries, as well as propelling ultranationalist fervor. Increasing political cynicism, as well as raising the level of civil society's political consciousness. So you see the double movement that's happening because of communication technologies. And this makes it very much more difficult to govern during that kind of period. There's no question that individual citizens have been empowered because of the rise in the advances in modern technology. But at the same time, because of their adeptness at dealing with modern communication systems, state leaders and powerful elites have also been empowered vis-a-vis civil society. So modern transportation has allowed people of formerly distant places to interact more frequently with people over here. It has also acted as a conduit for bringing individuals of different countries with similar interests together. But it's also served to facilitate transnational criminal activity. It's served to exacerbate, in some cases, social cleavages. So the overall effect of what I've described here has also been described by James Camilleri and Jim Falk as a shrinkage in social, political, economic, and cultural distances. Because of this shrinkage, because of this phenomenon, formerly dense and opaque frontiers are being dissolved. That's breaking down the Westphalian notion of inside versus outside. This container concept that we tend to use in political science to describe what's going on. National boundaries are no longer able to separate friend from foe, despite Donald Trump's attempt to build a wall. But the technological revolution has also potentially created in the minds of many people around the world a sense of global citizenship, which could result eventually in the transfer of individual loyalties from sovereignty-bound, the nation-state, to sovereignty-free governance bodies. And this changing relationship between public and private spheres and the virtual collapse of the dividing line that separates the domestic from the external environment suggests a fluidity that's new integrated global system has produced, and the notion of a fragmented system of nationally delineated sovereign entities is no longer tenable. However, this does not mean that the global civil society is being formed, or that the nation state is going nowhere anytime soon. I think one can argue that the nation state is still here, and you can see this in its attempts to sort of react against the growth of the global civil society, to react against some of these attempts to break down the the power that nation states normally have. But one thing I can say is that the technological revolution, globalization, etc., has contributed to global space and time shrinkage. And there's also the globalization of trade, production, and finance has resulted in a marked decline in many governments' ability to control those sectors. So there's a kind of I would call it a diminishing power of the nation state as a result of these forces. And it's opened the door for other actors besides nation states to fill that void. And therefore the diminishing of power of the nation state requires us to think seriously about any sort of global governance mechanism that used to be controlled by the nation state. There are other ways in which globalization has facilitated the dissolution of formerly dense and opaque borders. For instance, economic globalization has resulted in a global division of labor that hardly respects state boundaries and sovereignty. It has, to a large extent, been responsible for the feminization of work, particularly in the developing world. This penetrates traditional gender boundaries. The international movement of capital via electronic transfers has also had major effects on the reallocation of authority and power structures. And similarly, media globalization through satellite networks like CNN, MSNBC, BBC, Al Jazeera, the Internet superhighway has contributed to the diffusion of power. Its impact raises the possibility of the development of a truly global civil society, something that we could not imagine maybe a few years ago. But it could transform the nature of multilateralism, and it could transform the way we view governance today. At the same time, global media ownership is becoming so concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy individuals, powerful individuals, and conglomerates, that the end result is a reduced competition and increased homogenization of content. I think what is clear from that overview I've given really shows that there is a clash between complex interdependence and globalization phenomena on the one hand, and isolationist and disentanglement forces on the other. And this is challenging international governance as we know it today, and raises the possibility of the emergence of other forms of governance at a global level to adequately address transnational and domestic issues and problems that we face. Now, what I want to do is move on to the kind of governance that we have today and how that can be transformed. Now, as you know, since 1945, we've had the creations of the United Nations system as a global form of governance. But we've had in the past a whole different type of governance system, from empires to balance of power arrangements, to plurilateral and transversal bodies, to formal and informal limited purpose intergovernmental organizations, to formal and informal multi-purpose international organizations, to regional intergovernmental organizations, trans-regional organizations, transnational non-governmental organizations, and regimes. Today we have what I would call summative governance as a paradigm, a new paradigm, with multi-level global governance. I think Amitabh Acharya talks about this in terms of multiplex global governance. Everything from the multiplex theater, where you can go in and watch a movie in one theater, while others are watching movies in another theater. This sort of idea of a multiplex governance system explains to him the direction in which we have come. This sort of summative global governance, as they call it. There are transnational corporations, business associations, public and private consortia, moderating agencies, transnational social movements, transnational advocacy networks, epistemic communities, transversal and plurilateral organizations, coalitions of the willing, coalitions of non-governmental organizations, formal and informal regimes, terrorist organizations as well, and security communities. This to me sums up in large part what I would call a summative global governance picture. And it's within that context that we have to start to think about global governance architecture being transformed into something else than what we've been used to. And that's where I'm going to end my lecture today. The recent interest in multi-level governance, multi-level global governance, in large part from its recognition of the scale of global change, the shrinkage of time and space within the last 70 years, the emergence of transnational civil society, the rising interdependence among actors, state and non-state, within international society, the rise in the number and complexity of transnational and domestic societies, the rise in the number of issues that have been addressed by the United Nations system and other organizations, and the failure and inability sometimes to address those issues. All these things provide common goods and security guarantees for citizens are in jeopardy. Particularly since the end of World War II, we've witnessed at least 3 different challenges to traditional Westphalian international governance systems as represented in the institutional United Nations system. First, the technological revolution has made it possible for many actors other than states to enter on the world stage and to demand a role in the decision-making at that level. Secondly, the intensification of globalization has altered the relationship between citizens, the state, and international organizations. Globalization facilitated greater participation of non-state actors in governance processes normally reserved for states. But because globalization is a double-edged sword, it has also made it easier for transnational criminal organizations and terrorist organizations to command the attention of government bodies at all levels. It has also widened the gap between the rich and the poor, thereby increasing the challenges of intergovernmental bodies. And thirdly, the end of the Cold War can be seen as a historical turning point for intergovernmental institutions. It has resulted in the exponential expansion in the scope and the agenda of international governmental organizations. So much so that these organizations are having to contract out their work to other organizations and services. All 3 of these challenges, I think, has created new problems for governance and ensures that even more actors ought to be involved in the managing of these problems. I was telling students today of an example at the United Nations. The Canadian delegation goes to the United Nations, the General Assembly, and you'll see in the back of where they're sitting at the table, you always have the Canadian sign there, Canada's sign there, and the representative, the permanent representative of the United Nations in the front, and then there are a whole bunch of people on the back. Okay? Some of those individuals are not state actors. Some of those individuals are, in some cases, environmental activists, global health experts, people with particular niche of understandings of how things should operate, and they're able to advise the permanent member what to say in their presentations. This shows to me that there is a kind of a shift happening in how we present the United Nations as a state-based organization. It's no longer just a state-based organization from that point of view. And one of the other things I want to mention as we try to wrap up here is that there are some people, scholars, who are looking at this problem of governance today and trying to sort of come up with a normative view of how we can transform global governance. One of those was Robert Cox, who unfortunately recently passed away. And Robert Cox, through his multilateralism and United Nations system research project that began in 1992, I was a student at the time at the beginning of that project. And by the time it was finished, I was a professor at the University of Alberta. But because of the MUNS program, the Multilateralism and United Nations System program, there's been an attempt made by scholars to understand the long-term structural changes that are necessary, the need for transformation of the United Nations system rather than tinkering and reforming the organization. And there's less explicit goal of considering a future new multilateral project built from the bottom up. That's very different from most of the governing organizations that we've created. They're mostly being top down. So there's this idea that we should be building from the bottom up. The bottom-up multilateralism is conceived as organic and network-based, with discourse mechanisms as well as democratic structures to ensure accountability to the world's peoples. At the same time, the multilateralism United Nations system researchers have begun to realize that the constraints imposed by the more powerful on the attention of the less powerful to play a greater role in global governance must cease. In other words, we should include at the table of discussion making those less powerful, the marginalized. And I think this is one of the directions in which we're going to go in the future. Finally, we have to look at the summative nature of global governance and try to understand how the principles and the norms and the rules and the practices and decision-making procedures are shifting as we go along. While national governments and the United Nations system are still very much central to the activities of global governance, they only form a part of the overall picture of global governance. So in conclusion, let me say that during the interregnum, it gives us an opportunity now to reconceptualize what we mean by global governance, to think about ways in which we need to change the processes and institutions of governance, and also to allow us to have a normative position on global governance that will bring in those people who have been marginalized, who have been left out in the past processes of creating global governance. To me, this is a period of interregnum that will allow us to think about creating a new structure of global governance. At this juncture of transformation, the interregnum itself, the governance system of the globe is clearly bifurcated. The interstate system of governance is still with us, but we are observing the emergence of a multi-centric system of diverse types of collectivities. Combined, we can label this summative global governance. It's a kind of governance that requires a subsidiarity principle to guide its operations. It is much more sophisticated and flexible than previous forms of governance, and it may provide the needed space and time for the traditional intergovernmental institutions to make the kinds of changes that are required for a more effective, efficient, and relevant global governance system. So I'm going to end it there, so open up some questions and try to answer some of your concerns from this talk. Thank you very much.